Hello, my name is Ethan Astle, and today I would like to share with you what I learned about um, chemical pollution and pesticides from Silent Spring, and also what I've been able to learn about the new environmental crisis that we're facing today with plastic pollution. And as we go through this presentation together today, it'll be interesting to see how these two different kinds of pollution are different, but also how they're similar, and how we've been able to overcome both of these kinds of issues, and what we're still doing today to overcome plastic pollution, and what each of us can do to make a difference in our environment, in our world. So let's get into it today. To start off, let's just go ahead and introduce Silent Spring and the new problem that we're facing today. So Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was really a major wake-up call during its time period. It highlighted a lot of the different impacts and harm that pesticides and chemical pollution can have on the environment. A lot of the time, these pesticides and chemicals were engineered to target specific pests and weeds, but oftentimes these pests and weeds weren't really pests or weeds. They were important parts of the ecosystem in that area. And so by eliminating them, it caused imbalance and caused a lot of harm to the other animals and the wildlife there. And while they targeted specific plants and animals, it didn't always work that way. It ended up affecting a lot of the other plants and animals, not just by damaging the ecosystem, but also by just directly poisoning other plants and animals that weren't initially targeted. And so we've made a lot of progress now with the chemicals that we use today and the amount of chemical usage that goes on. But there are different problems that we're facing right now. And like I introduced earlier, plastic pollution is a major problem in our world right now. And as we go through this presentation today, it'll be interesting to see how chemical pollution, as highlighted in Silent Spring, has a lot of similarities to plastic pollution in our day. Moving on now, let's talk about some of the consequences of pesticides. DDT and other pesticides were widely used, and in some cases they were even encouraged by the government in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The government would encourage the usage of pesticides and would sometimes sponsor some chemical sprayings or treatments. Thankfully, in the 70s, the government was able to realize what the real effects of these chemicals were, and they were able to change their policies. But since these chemicals were so heavily used during this time period, some of these next effects that we're going to talk about were really amplified during that time period. One of the major problems with these pesticides is how long they remain active in the environment. Depending on the type of soil and the type of chemical, the potency of that chemical, these factors can affect this, but in some cases, these chemicals can be detected in the soil for decades after that area was treated, which can create a lot of long-term problems in that environment. Obviously, these pesticides are very harmful to wildlife. They poison them, or they can cause imbalances in the environment that can make it uninhabitable for some of the animals living there. And eventually these chemicals can even make their way back to humans and create public health risks. Or in some cases, they can end up affecting the animal or the plant that was intended to be protected or benefit from the chemical treatment. One example from Silent Spring is with the cattle during that time period. Farmers wanted their cattle to have only the best grass, and so they ended up spraying their fields to get rid of the other species of grass, just so they could have the kind of grass that they wanted their cows eating. But unfortunately, during the winter, the tougher grass that the cows normally fed on and lived off of during the winter wasn't there because of the chemical treatment, which actually caused some of the cattle to die, which was the opposite outcome of what the farmers were hoping for. And as these chemicals are consumed or exposed to by smaller organisms, those small organisms can be eaten by larger organisms, which can eventually make their way back to humans and can poison them, and in some cases create public health risks. And as we can see here in this kind of funny but also not funny photo, DDT is good for me, right? These things, like the person, the cow, the crops, they're supposed to be benefiting from these chemicals, but in reality, it was having the opposite effect. So next, let's talk about some of the consequences of plastics and plastic pollution. Well, what's the problem? Plastics are incredibly common. If you just look around, you will be able to see that there are countless products that you use every single day that have plastic components or packaging. And beyond that, there are microplastics in our world. Microplastics are incredibly small. And because of that, they can contaminate soil and water sources, kind of like pesticides and other chemicals can. These microplastics are formed as plastic breaks down, and sometimes microplastics are already present in the products that we consume. Like in cosmetics, you'll find microplastics within your cosmetic products. Plastics can be harmful to the environment, and they can have a negative effect on public health as well, similar to chemical pollution. The chemicals within plastic and the toxins that plastic can have are not good for humans or for any form of life. And like pesticides, plastics can also take a really long time to break down, which can leave a lasting effect on the environment for generations. All right, now that we've talked about some of the consequences of chemical and plastic pollution, let's go ahead and get a little bit more specific and talk about some of what the actual effects are of these types of pollution. And we'll go ahead and focus on chemical pollution to start. So first off, pesticides and chemical poisoning can cause damage to a lot of different bodily systems. As we can see in this little graph here, there are a lot of different parts of the body and bodily systems that are affected by chemical poisoning. Notably, chemical poisoning and pesticides can cause cancers and birth defects. And as is highlighted in Silent Spring, death by chemical poisoning is a painful one. In Silent Spring, we get accounts of birds spasming and trembling before they die, and even human beings who were affected by chemicals experiencing intense headaches, having trouble breathing, and also seizing up and spasming. So not only is it negative, not only does it have a negative impact on the environment, but it's also a pretty gruesome impact as well. Pesticides can disrupt entire ecosystems. As we talked about earlier, a lot of the times the chemicals that farmers and sprayers used often ended up affecting more species than the pests that they were targeting. Small organisms absorbed the pesticides, the bigger organisms consumed those smaller ones, and in some cases they may get back to humans, which can cause some of these symptoms. And if it's not enough already, it's not even a long-term solution, and honestly, not even a short-term solution at that. Because often the insects or the plants that were targeted by these chemicals would adapt and become resistant to the chemicals that the sprayers and the farmers were using, which would cause the farmers and the sprayers to go back, double down, and create a new chemical or more potent chemical to try and kill these plants and animals, which would just cause the plants and animals to adapt, creating a vicious cycle where the problem wasn't really getting solved, and we were just dumping chemicals into the environment. All right, and next, let's talk about some of the actual effects and symptoms of plastic pollution and plastic poisoning. So, like chemical poisoning, plastic poisoning also causes damage to bodily systems, as we can see here in this little chart. And plastic poisoning can also increase the chances for cancer, diabetes, and the toxins from plastic can also be lethal, just like how chemical poisoning can be lethal. In fact, animals regularly die from plastic poisoning, and they also die by getting tangled up in plastic packaging and other things like that. Um, and also, similar to chemicals and pesticides, small animals will end up consuming microplastics that move up the food chain back to humans. This is especially common in fish, as smaller fish end up eating these microplastics, thinking they're food, or eating microplastics along with their food, moving up the food chain back to humans. Another problem with plastic pollution is that it's actually a form of permanent contamination because plastics never fully break down, which leads to essentially permanent contamination of the environment because once it's out there, it's never going to be gone. And here we can see some of the effects of these kinds of pollution in real life in photos. And so on the left, starting here on the left, we can see this bird who has suffered from chemical pollution and from pesticides. And over here, we can see this turtle and this seal who are suffering from plastic pollution, who are caught in plastic waste and in nets. And down here at the bottom, there's a photo of some fish that were killed due to their water being contaminated by chemical poisoning. And up here on the top right is a bald eagle who suffered from chemical poisoning and pesticides. And this is actually a pretty famous example and one that is brought up in Silent Spring, how bald eagles were a major victim of pesticides and how they were unintentionally killed off, or not completely killed off, but killed by chemical poisoning and pesticides. And eventually they became an endangered species, reaching an all-time low of only 417 known nesting pairs. And thankfully, due to the actions of the government and other organizations, bald eagles have been able to rebound and are a much more healthy population now. And here we can see a deer who is suffering from some plastic pollution. And so we see it's not just the sea creatures who are affected by our plastic waste, but also land animals as well. Thankfully, now we've been able to solve a lot of the problems surrounding DDT and other harmful chemicals. So I think it's important that we take a closer look how we were able to make progress and solve the problem. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Silent Spring was a crucial text that helped raise awareness and sparked change in our practices when it comes to pesticides and other harmful chemicals. As a result of Silent Spring, John F. Kennedy's Science Advisory Committee investigated the impact of pesticides, and they actually ended up supporting the claims that were made in Silent Spring. As a result of that, the government ended up forming the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in 1970, and restricted the usage of pesticides and banned DDT in 1972. The Clean Water Act and Endangered Species Act were also created in 1972 and 1973 to continue to protect the environment and to minimize the damages that were caused by chemical pollution. There were and continue to be developments in agricultural practices to involve more organic and environmentally friendly solutions for farmers. While there are certainly still issues with chemical pollution in our country and in our world, we've been able to solve a lot of those problems and keep it to a minimum. Okay, so looking now to today with our problem of plastic pollution and plastic poisoning, how can we solve our problem? Well, first off, there are bans. There's been an increasing number of bans, especially on single-use plastic bags. And some of these states, and some states have already outlawed these kinds of bags altogether. The government and other organizations have poured more money and more resources than ever before into cleaning out trash from oceans and from other bodies of water to try and remedy some of the damage that has already been done. Because as I mentioned earlier, plastics never fully break down, and so they'll continue to remain in the environment and contaminate the environment. And so we need to get it out if we ever want to reduce the amount of plastics in our environment. There's also been an increase in the amount of recyclables and biodegradable materials used in our products in place of plastics to help prevent more contamination and plastic pollution in our world. But despite all these steps that we've taken, plastic pollution and poisoning are still very real threats, not only to the environment, but to human life as well, which is why everyone needs to do their part. If we're going to take on a problem of this scale, everyone needs to contribute. This can come in the form of choosing to use reusable bags and reusable water bottles instead of using disposable ones. It can come in the form of being conscious about our recycling and choosing to clean up our communities and do what we can. If we're going to clean up our world, we all need to do our part. To kind of sum up what we've talked about today, I made this little comparison chart between pesticides and plastic pollution and some of the factors that go into it. And you can see that a lot of these things are pretty similar. Like if you go through it, I mean, obviously the sources of the pollution are different, but the impact on the environment and the health effects are pretty similar. And of course, there's a little bit of a different response and ways that we can get public awareness for these two different kinds of pollutions. But if you look at it, they're honestly pretty similar. And we've been able to reduce the issues caused by pesticides and chemical poisoning a lot. And now we have this new problem of plastic pollution. But to me, it's almost a little bit comforting to see how similar these two kinds of pollutions are. Because even though plastic pollution is a really big problem, we've been able to overcome types of pollution like plastic pollution before. And so if we've done it once, we can do it again. And I believe that we can overcome plastic pollution and clean up our world. Silent Spring is an important book that highlights some serious problems and offers some important solutions. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing that Silent Spring accomplished was creating a spark for positive change. It is almost eerie to consider how similar the effects of pesticides and plastic pollution are. Silent Spring was a spark that created some major policy changes and protected the world that we live in. Now we face this new beast of plastic pollution. And while it might seem overwhelming, there are things that we can do to spark change within our own circles of influence, within our communities, and in the world. We need to push for changes in our government and in our world and conquer the problem of plastic pollution. We can each choose to be a spark for positive change. We can each choose to fight against plastic pollution. And I know that as we work together and combine our efforts with those around us, that we can transform the world.